The Dark Scrolls. In the grand halls of Tudor England, where stone walls echoed with both splendor and secrets, a gentle figure walked quietly among the courtiers. Jane Seymour, the third wife of Henry VIII, was not a woman of flamboyance or dramatic gestures like her predecessor Anne Boleyn. She carried herself with a modest grace, her pale complexion glowing beneath the candlelight, her eyes soft and downcast, her words always chosen with care. To those who observed her, she seemed almost fragile, like porcelain, but within her was a will that came not from ambition for herself, but from an understanding of duty. She knew that her place in the palace, her worth to the king, and even her survival depended upon one thing alone, the ability to bear him a son. England at that time trembled under the weight of uncertainty. Henry VIII's longing for a male heir had already reshaped the kingdom, severing ties with the Catholic Church and giving birth to the English Reformation. Catherine of Aragon had given him only a daughter who survived, Mary. Anne Boleyn, the woman for whom he had risked his crown, had fallen from grace and died beneath the blade of the executioner, leaving behind another daughter, Elizabeth. Both girls were precious in their own right, but neither satisfied the king's insatiable desire for a son who could secure the Tudor dynasty against rival claims and whispers of illegitimacy. Jane Seymour entered Henry's life as a symbol of hope, a quiet promise of stability, and above all the possibility of the son that history tells us she would give him. The court was alive with expectation from the moment her pregnancy was confirmed. Every servant, every courtier, every whispering noble seemed to watch her with a gaze that was at once reverent and anxious. She was no longer just a queen consort, she was a vessel for the future of the realm. The chambers of Hampton Court were adjusted for her comfort, yet, in truth, no comfort could soften the enormity of her burden. The air smelled of burning candles and dried herbs that physicians claimed would protect her from misfortune. Silken sheets embroidered with golden threads adorned her bed, while tapestries told stories of great heroes and saints, reminders that her struggle was part of a divine design. As her belly swelled, the court grew restless. Rumors circulated endlessly. Was it a boy? Was she healthy enough to carry to term? Could her body withstand the trial of labor? Unlike Catherine, who had endured the heartbreak of stillbirths and miscarriages, or Anne, who had failed to produce the longed-for heir, Jane seemed favored by fortune. She glided through her months with a calm dignity, her hands often folded over her womb, her prayers whispered to the Virgin Mary, though the realm itself had been pulled from Rome's embrace. Henry, who was often impatient, even cruel, displayed an unusual tenderness toward her. He visited her chamber with a softness that few had seen before, sitting beside her bed, speaking to her belly as though his unborn son could already hear him. And yet, beneath the surface of this carefully woven serenity, Jane lived with constant unease. She had seen what had happened to the women before her. She knew the dangers of childbirth, dangers multiplied in a time without true medicine. Fever, blood loss, exhaustion, these were words whispered among women in hushed tones, not spoken in the king's presence, but feared with every heartbeat. Nights were long for Jane. Sometimes she would press her hand to her abdomen and wonder if the life inside her would be her salvation or her undoing. She would hear the bells of the chapel and think of her soul, wondering if God's design for her was to be remembered as the mother of a king or as another of Henry's wives sacrificed upon the altar of his ambition. Summer passed into autumn, and the gardens outside Hampton Court glistened with dew in the early mornings. Courtiers planned celebrations in anticipation of the birth. Musicians tuned their instruments, cooks prepared recipes for a banquet fit for the birth of an heir, and tailors sewed tiny garments of fine linen and velvet. The mood of the palace, however, was a delicate balance between hope and dread. The women who attended Jane, her ladies-in-waiting, moved silently around her chambers, adjusting her pillows, fanning her face when she grew faint, carrying trays of broth and sugared almonds. They smiled at her, but in their hearts, each of them remembered stories of queens who had bled to death, who had never risen from their childbed. The king himself vacillated between joy and fear. He had waited for this moment for so long that he could scarcely contain his anticipation. Yet he was haunted too by memory, the sight of Catherine weeping for lost children, the moment Anne's head fell into the straw. For Henry, Jane was more than a wife. She was his last chance at a legacy secured by blood. He lavished gifts upon her, jewels that glimmered in the candlelight, silks imported from Italy, golden crucifixes despite his break from Rome. He would take her hand in his, a rare gesture of gentleness, and murmur that she was his most beloved. But all his affection was, in truth, bound tightly to the hope that she would give him the son he desired. Jane bore his attentions with humility. She was not a woman to wield her charm like Anne, nor to challenge him with fiery words. Instead, she moved like a quiet river, steady, calm, but unrelenting in its course. In private moments, she would sit at the window overlooking the gardens, embroidery in her lap, and think of the life that would soon enter the world. Sometimes she whispered to her unborn child, promising love, protection, and prayers. Other times she simply closed her eyes and let the silence enfold her, trying to still the storm of worry within. As the final weeks approached, the palace shifted into a state of vigilant anticipation. Physicians, trained more in ritual than science, inspected her pulse and declared that her strength was sufficient. Herbal concoctions were brewed, charms tied discreetly into the folds of her bedding, and prayers were said in chapels across the realm for the safe delivery of a prince. On the surface, the atmosphere gleamed with celebration. Beneath it, dread pooled like shadows in the corners. Jane herself carried both hope and fear within her, like two sides of the same coin. The nights grew colder. Fires burned in the great hearths, their smoke rising in twisting patterns against the carved wooden ceilings. Jane often lay awake, listening to the crackling flames, the distant hoot of owls, the soft rustling of servants' feet. She thought of her family far away, of her childhood days when she could run freely without the weight of a crown upon her brow. She thought, too, of Catherine and Anne, the women whose shadows still haunted the court. Their lives and deaths had paved the path she now walked. She wondered if one day another woman would think of her in the same way, Jane, the gentle queen, who gave all she had for England. In these quiet moments, her body heavy and her heart uncertain, Jane seemed to understand something that few others did, that queenship was not only about jewels and titles, but about sacrifice, and that sometimes the crown upon one's head could be as heavy as chains. When the first pains began to stir in her body, the palace trembled with both excitement and terror. The great moment had arrived. Servants rushed through corridors carrying bowls of steaming water, linens fresh from the laundry, candles to light every corner of the chamber. Midwives prepared their tools, whispering prayers under their breath. Courtiers gathered in outer rooms, pacing, waiting for the cry that would decide the future of the realm. Jane herself lay upon the bed, her face pale, her hair damp with sweat. She gripped the sheets with trembling hands as waves of pain surged through her. The air was thick with the scent of wax, herbs, and the unmistakable tension of fear. Hours stretched like eternities. She clenched her jaw, her gentle demeanor giving way to the raw truth of a woman in labor. No queen, no jewel, no title could shield her from this universal trial. Her cries echoed off the walls, mingling with the muttered words of encouragement from her attendants. Beyond the chamber, Henry VIII waited, restless, his heart pounding louder than the footsteps of messengers. Every moment without news deepened the furrow of his brow. Courtiers dared not speak too loudly in his presence, for they knew the stakes. If Jane succeeded, Henry's joy would know no bounds. If she failed, if the child was lost, or if she herself perished, the consequences would ripple through the kingdom like a storm. As dawn broke over the palace, light spilling across the tapestries of saints and kings, Jane's ordeal was far from over. The labor was long, relentless, testing the limits of her strength. Her ladies wept silently as they dabbed her brow, whispering to her to hold on, to think of the child, to think of the glory that awaited her if she endured. Jane's breaths came ragged, her eyes glazed with exhaustion, yet deep within her remained a spark, a will to give England what it demanded. The story of Jane Seymour was only beginning to unfold, but already the lines of tragedy were etched into its pages. For while the promise of life drew nearer with each passing hour, so too did the shadow of death. In the gilded chambers of Hampton Court, amidst the splendor of tapestries and jewels, the most human of struggles played out, the struggle of a woman, a queen, fighting to bring forth life at the cost of her own. The hours of Jane's labor stretched into an ordeal that seemed to bend time itself. What began as a faint ache had grown into an unrelenting storm of pain that rolled through her body with terrifying force. The chamber was cloaked in a haze of candle smoke, and the pungent aroma of herbs, meant to ward off evil spirits and hasten delivery. The windows were draped shut, muffling the sounds of the court beyond, so that the only noises were Jane's ragged breaths, the whispered prayers of her attendants, and the low crackle of the fire in the hearth. Jane's face, pale as ivory, gleamed with sweat. Strands of hair clung to her temples, and her once serene eyes were now clouded with exhaustion. She had always carried herself with quiet composure, a queen who moved with dignity. But here in this room, stripped of the masks of royalty, she was simply a woman enduring the most ancient and perilous of struggles. She clutched the sheets until her knuckles turned white, her cries rising and falling with the rhythm of her body's torment. The midwives murmured to one another in hushed voices. They knew the dangers of a labor that dragged on so mercilessly. They feared infection, blood loss, the possibility that both mother and child might be lost. Yet in the presence of their queen, they dared not voice their darkest thoughts. Instead, they urged her onward with gentle tones, dabbing her brow with cool cloths, slipping spoonfuls of watered wine to her lips, whispering that the end was near, even when they did not know. Henry VIII waited in an adjoining chamber, his impatience growing with each passing hour. He was a man used to command, to conquest, to bending the world to his will. But here he could do nothing. Pacing the floor, his heavy footsteps echoed against the paneled walls. His courtiers stood in uneasy silence, casting nervous glances toward him, aware that his temper was as volatile as gunpowder. At moments he seemed elated, declaring that God had finally blessed him with a son. At others he grew sullen, his face dark with memories of past disappointments. When messengers entered to bring updates, he seized upon their words with a desperation that betrayed his carefully crafted image of power. For Henry, this night was not merely about a child, it was about his entire legacy. 2 queens had already fallen under the shadow of his quest for a son. Catherine had been cast aside after years of fruitless hope. Anne had been executed, her blood staining the ground at Tower Hill, her only surviving child a daughter. Jane was his last chance to secure the future he craved. The weight of that longing pressed upon her more heavily than any crown. Inside the chamber, the hours blurred into one another. Jane drifted between consciousness and a haze of pain. Sometimes she moaned softly, other times she cried out, her voice echoing with a rawness that broke the hearts of those who loved her. She whispered prayers through cracked lips, asking God to protect the child within her, even as her own strength dwindled. There were moments when she thought of her childhood at Wolf Hall, when she had run freely in the fields, unaware of the destiny that awaited her. There were moments when she thought of Anne Boleyn, whose shadow still lingered over the court, and wondered if she too would become a cautionary tale whispered about by courtiers long after her death. The women surrounding her worked tirelessly, massaging her limbs, guiding her breathing, coaxing her to hold on. Their faces were masks of composure, but beneath their calm, fear gnawed at them. They had attended many births before, but never one so fraught with consequence. For this was not just a child. It was the heir to the throne, the future of England. If Jane faltered, the kingdom itself would tremble. As dawn crept into the sky, its pale light seeping through the curtains, Jane was still in the throes of labor. Her body shook with each contraction, her breath rasping like wind through dry reeds. The midwives exchanged desperate looks. Never had they seen a queen endure so long, so unrelenting a struggle. Yet Jane, fragile as she appeared, clung stubbornly to life, to her duty. Every cry was a testament to her resolve. At last, after more than 2 days, the cries of a newborn broke through the chamber. It was a sound that seemed to split the air, to banish the heaviness of dread that had lingered. A boy, strong, living, his tiny lungs filling the room with the promise of a future long denied. Tears welled in the eyes of the attendants as they wrapped him in swaddling clothes of golden embroidery. With reverence, they placed him in Jane's trembling arms. Exhausted, nearly broken, Jane gazed down at her son. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, her eyes glistening with relief and pride. She whispered a prayer of thanks, though her voice was barely more than a breath. In that moment, all the pain, all the fear, seemed to dissolve, replaced by the fragile joy of a mother holding her child for the first time. The announcement swept through Hampton Court like wildfire. Bells rang out, courtiers cheered, and the people of England rejoiced. At last Henry VIII had his son, Edward, the long-awaited heir to the Tudor throne. The king himself wept openly when he beheld the child, lifting him high for all to see. He declared that the kingdom had been blessed beyond measure, that the future of his dynasty was secure. Banquets were ordered, musicians played triumphant melodies, and for a brief time all of England seemed to exhale in relief. Yet, even as the celebrations filled the air, a shadow lingered in the Queen's chamber. Jane lay weak, her strength nearly spent. Though she clung to her son with all the love in her heart, her body bore the marks of her ordeal. The midwives noticed the pallor of her skin, the feverish heat that lingered in her cheeks, the faint trembling of her hands. They whispered among themselves, knowing that the danger was far from over. In a world without true medicine, childbirth did not end with delivery. It often marked the beginning of a perilous aftermath. Still, for a time, Jane lived in the glow of triumph. She had succeeded where others had failed. She had given Henry the son he desired, the child who would one day rule England. Courtiers bowed before her with newfound respect, calling her the savior of the dynasty. Henry himself doted upon her, praising her as his most beloved queen. He walked with pride, his chest puffed with the certainty that his legacy was secure. But Jane herself seemed strangely quiet. As she gazed upon her son, she appeared more contemplative than celebratory, as though she understood something that others did not. She had fulfilled her duty, but at what cost? Her body was frail, her energy fading with each passing day. She smiled for her husband, for her courtiers, for the people who rejoiced outside the palace walls, but behind those smiles was a weariness that clung to her like a shadow. Her attendants watched her closely, fearful of the fever that sometimes gripped her, the bleeding that did not fully cease, the weariness that sleep could not mend. They changed her linens, offered her broths and tonics, whispered encouragements. But each day they saw her strength slip further away. Her breaths grew shallow, her face thinner, her eyes dimmer. Henry, intoxicated by the joy of his new son, refused at first to see the danger. He spoke of Edward's future, of the glorious reign that awaited him, of the stability Jane had brought to the kingdom. He basked in the celebrations, in the adoration of his court. Yet when he returned to her chamber, when he saw her pale form lying amidst the silks and the shadows, a flicker of fear stirred within him. He reached for her hand, feeling how cold it had become, and for the first time in years, Henry VIII was powerless. For Jane Seymour, the gentle queen, the triumph of motherhood was inseparable from the tragedy that loomed ever closer. The court rejoiced, but within the walls of her chamber the fragile line between life and death grew thinner with each passing hour. The queen who had given England its long-awaited heir was fading, even as her child grew stronger in her arms. And though history would remember her as the mother of Edward VI, those who stood beside her bed in those days would remember something else as well. The quiet courage of a woman who endured the most terrible trial with grace, and whose final gift to her kingdom was purchased with her very life. The birth of Prince Edward transformed Hampton Court into a place of jubilation. Bells pealed across the countryside, their chimes carried by the autumn wind. Bonfires were lit in towns and villages. Alehouses overflowed with cheer as peasants toasted the health of their new prince. For the common folk, the arrival of a male heir promised stability in a kingdom long unsettled by uncertainty. At the heart of the celebration, Henry VIII stood taller than ever, pride radiating from him like the glow of the torches that illuminated the palace grounds. He had a son. At last, the Tudor dynasty stood secure. Yet behind the heavy oak doors of Jane Seymour's chamber, the atmosphere was entirely different. While the world rejoiced, the queen lay motionless beneath layers of embroidered silk. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow, her body drained from the ordeal that had consumed her. She had endured more than 2 days of relentless labor, and though she had emerged with her son in her arms, her strength had been left behind in that battle. The midwives and physicians hovered anxiously around her bed. They whispered among themselves, their words filled with unspoken dread. Jane's pulse was weak, her body racked with fever that rose and fell unpredictably. They prepared infusions of herbs, poultices scented with rosemary and sage, believing them to draw out the sickness. Holy relics were brought into the chamber, prayers whispered over her as though faith itself might anchor her fragile life. But even as attendants moved with desperate devotion, a shadow loomed over their efforts. Jane clung to consciousness in fits and starts. At times she would rouse enough to hold her son, to press her lips softly against his downy head, her eyes shining with quiet pride. In those moments her attendants saw not a queen but a mother, tender and filled with love. She would whisper to him, words too faint for others to catch, murmurs of affection that belonged only to them. But soon exhaustion would overwhelm her, and she would slip back into feverish sleep, her skin clammy, her body trembling. Henry visited often, though not as often as Jane might have wished. At first, his appearances were filled with triumph. He would sweep into the chamber with an entourage of courtiers, his booming voice filling the space as he proclaimed the glory of their son. He would stand over Jane's bed, smiling broadly, praising her as the jewel of England. But as days passed and it became clear that Jane's recovery was not assured, his visits grew shorter, more restrained. He could not bear to linger in the presence of weakness, for Henry was a man who turned his face from frailty, even in those he loved. Still, there were moments of tenderness. He would sit beside her, holding her hand, speaking in low tones that the courtiers outside could not hear. He told her of Edward's future, of the greatness their son would achieve, of the legacy she had secured for them both. He called her his beloved queen, his angel, and Jane, though often too weak to reply, would smile faintly, her eyes filled with both love and resignation. The court, meanwhile, surged with activity. Plans for the prince's christening were set in motion immediately. It would be a spectacle unlike any other, a declaration to the world that England's dynasty was secure. Nobles competed for the honor of carrying the infant in procession, of standing as godparents, of placing their names forever beside the heir to the throne. Musicians rehearsed, priests prepared elaborate ceremonies, and seamstresses worked day and night on gowns of velvet and cloth of gold. Through all this, Jane's health wavered. Her attendants knew that the strain of the christening would be unbearable for her, yet she insisted on participating, even if only briefly. To absent herself from the ceremony would be seen as a sign of weakness, and Jane, though frail, still understood the demands of duty. She had sacrificed her body to bring Edward into the world. She would not let her absence cast a shadow over his first public moment as heir. On the day of the christening, the chapel glowed with candlelight. Incense curled upward toward vaulted ceilings, mingling with the voices of choristers whose hymns filled the sacred space. Nobles in silks and furs gathered, their jewels glittering in the flickering light. The infant Edward, swaddled in cloth of gold, was carried to the font, where holy water blessed his brow. He was named in honor of Saint Edward the Confessor, a reminder of England's sacred lineage. Jane, though pale and frail, was present. She sat in a chair adorned with cushions, her body propped upright, her eyes fixed on her child. Those who looked upon her that day saw a woman diminished in strength, yet radiant in spirit. She watched as her son was carried through the chapel, the weight of the dynasty resting in his tiny frame. Tears glistened in her eyes, not only from pride, but from the unspoken knowledge that this might be the last time she would see him in such triumph. After the ceremony, the court erupted in celebration once more. Banquets stretched long into the night, tables laden with roasted meats, spiced wines, sugared fruits. Minstrels sang of England's glory, dancers twirled in the torchlight, nobles toasted to Edward and to the Queen who had borne him. But within her chamber, Jane's body faltered. The exertion of the day had drained her remaining strength. Fever gripped her once more, her body shuddering as though caught in some unseen storm. Her ladies-in-waiting tended her with devotion, bathing her brow, speaking soothing words, holding her hand through the long nights. They prayed at her bedside, their whispered pleas rising into the silence. Yet nothing seemed to ease her suffering. Her body bled still, a slow and relentless drain that no potion could stop. Infection, that unseen enemy, took hold, and with each passing hour she slipped further from their grasp. Henry was informed of her decline, and for once the proud king was struck silent. The man who had defied popes and toppled kingdoms now found himself helpless in the face of his wife's suffering. He came to her side more often in those final days, though always accompanied by an air of desperation. He would sit by her bed, his massive figure dwarfing her frail frame, and for moments the court saw not a king, but a husband terrified of loss. He begged her to fight, to live, to stay by his side. Jane would look at him with weary eyes, her lips forming a faint smile, but no words came. On the 12th day after Edward's birth, the shadow that had lingered finally consumed her. Jane Seymour, the gentle queen, the mother of England's long-awaited son, breathed her last. The court fell into mourning. The celebrations turned suddenly hollow. Bells tolled once more, but this time their sound was heavy with grief. Drapes of black cloth were hung in the palace. Courtiers donned mourning attire, and the joyous songs that had filled the halls were replaced with the solemn tones of requiem. Henry was inconsolable. He shut himself away, refusing to speak with courtiers, his grief expressed in silence more profound than any outburst. Those who had known him feared his wrath. Instead, they witnessed a man broken, mourning not only the loss of his wife, but also the fragility of his triumph. For though he had his son, the cost had been unbearable. Jane's body was prepared with the greatest of care, dressed in robes befitting a queen, her hair arranged with delicate precision, her face smoothed into eternal serenity. She was placed in a coffin of oak, carried by solemn procession to St. George's Chapel at Windsor. There she would be laid to rest, the only one of Henry's wives to be buried beside him in death. Her legacy was sealed in that moment. Jane Seymour, remembered not for ambition or scandal, but for quiet dignity, for sacrifice, for the gift of the son who would carry the Tudor name. To the people of England she was a saintly figure, a queen who had given all for her country. To Henry she remained his true wife, the one he loved most deeply, though his love had been bound inextricably to the heir she had provided, and so the story of Jane Seymour became one of both triumph and tragedy. She had succeeded where others had failed, but the price of her success was her life. The kingdom rejoiced in Edward's birth, yet mourned the queen who had given him to them. In the annals of history, her name would forever be entwined with sacrifice, with the bittersweet joy of a mother's love, and with the enduring shadow of a crown that demanded everything and offered so little in return. The silence that followed Jane Seymour's passing was unlike any that had settled upon Hampton Court before. Only days earlier, the palace had been alive with music, laughter, and celebration, but now its corridors seemed burdened with grief. Black draperies swallowed the once bright tapestries, candles burned low and solemn, and the voices of courtiers hushed as though the very walls demanded reverence. The queen who had delivered England's long-desired heir was gone, and the joy of a dynasty secured had been darkened by the cost. Henry VIII shut himself away in his chambers, refusing food, refusing counsel, even refusing the company of those closest to him. For days he remained in seclusion, a man broken not by battle or politics, but by the death of the woman who had, for a brief, shining moment, made him believe he was blessed. It was said that courtiers would creep to his door and hear his footsteps pacing, hear the deep sighs of a man who carried a weight greater than any crown could impose. Henry, so often proud and unyielding, seemed suddenly human in his despair. When he emerged at last, his face was pale and gaunt, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. He spoke little, his voice flat, his commands terse. He allowed only a few trusted attendants to remain at his side. In those days he wore black as though it were armor, a visible declaration of the grief that even his kingly stature could not conceal. He told those who dared to speak of future marriages that they were fools, that no woman could ever replace Jane. In his heart he declared her his one true wife, the one he would remember above all others. Preparations for Jane's funeral began immediately. Unlike Anne Boleyn, whose fall had been swift and brutal, Jane was honored with the dignity befitting a queen beloved by her people. Her body, carefully embalmed, was dressed in robes of rich black velvet, trimmed with ermine. Her hair, once hidden beneath the modest hood she favored, was arranged with tender precision, framing her face so that she seemed almost to be sleeping. Over her hands was placed a crucifix of gold, and upon her chest lay a prayer book bound in velvet. The coffin, carved of oak and draped in cloth of gold, was placed upon a bier surrounded by flickering candles. Courtiers filed past to pay their respects, their heads bowed low, their eyes wet with tears. Many of the women wept openly, for they knew that Jane's suffering had been no different from their own, magnified only by the weight of her crown. For them she was not only a queen, but a sister in the eternal struggle of women against the dangers of childbirth. The procession to Windsor was long and somber. Horses, draped in black, pulled the funeral carriage along the muddy autumn roads. Bells tolled from every church along the route. their mournful clangs reverberating across the countryside. Peasants lined the roads, many crossing themselves as the bier passed, whispering prayers for the gentle queen who had given them a prince. Some clutched their own infants closer, aware that Jane had died of the very peril they too faced with each birth. In her sacrifice they saw both their own fragility and their own strength reflected back at them. At St. George's Chapel in Windsor, the coffin was borne inside with solemn ceremony. Priests intoned Latin prayers, their voices echoing beneath the vaulted ceilings. The scent of incense hung heavy in the air, mingling with the salty tang of tears. Nobles in mourning garb filled the pews, their jeweled finery muted beneath black veils. Henry himself was not present. He claimed that his grief was too great to bear witness. Some whispered that this absence was cowardice, others that it was love too deep to endure the sight. Whatever the truth, his decision left a hollow space in the ritual, as though the absence of the king underscored the finality of the loss. Jane was interred with honor, her body lowered into the vault that would one day hold Henry himself. It was a decision that spoke volumes, for in choosing to lie beside her in death, Henry declared her the only wife who had truly fulfilled her role, the only one he considered worthy of eternal companionship. In that stone tomb, the queen who had given England its heir would remain forever entwined with the man who had demanded so much of her. For the people of England, Jane Seymour quickly became an almost saintly figure. Ballads were sung of her gentle nature, her quiet dignity, her sacrifice. She was praised as the perfect queen, not for ambition or cunning, but for her submission, her obedience, her gift of a son. Women spoke of her with reverence, and men toasted her memory in alehouses. In death she embodied the ideal of womanhood that Henry and his court so fervently prized, though the truth of her suffering remained known only to those who had stood by her bed. The weeks after her passing were marked by a strange duality. On one hand, the kingdom rejoiced in the presence of Prince Edward, the tiny figure swaddled in royal linens, the promise of Tudor continuity. On the other, the court was subdued, haunted by the Queen's absence. Nobles spoke in hushed tones of Henry's grief, of his refusal to consider another marriage, of his solemn vows to honor Jane's memory forever. Yet those who knew the king well suspected that time, politics, and ambition would eventually erode even this vow. For Henry was not only a husband and father, he was a monarch, and his duty to secure his dynasty could not rest upon a single child. In the meantime, however, Jane's memory shaped the atmosphere of the court. Her presence lingered in the tapestries she had favored, in the quiet corners where she had once walked, in the nursery where her son slept. Servants spoke of her in whispers, as though she might yet be listening. Courtiers recalled her kindness, her humility, her piety. Even those who had once doubted her importance now acknowledged her as the most significant of Henry's queens, for she had given him what none other had. Henry himself seemed altered in those months. Though he remained the same imperious monarch, demanding obedience and basking in flattery, there was a hardness in his eyes that had not been there before. Some said that grief had carved it into him, that Jane's death had left a wound that never fully healed. Others believed that it was guilt, a recognition that his relentless pursuit of an heir had cost him the one woman he had truly loved. Whatever the truth, his reign from that moment carried an undercurrent of melancholy, a reminder that power and love were rarely companions, and that triumph was always shadowed by loss. At Windsor, where Jane lay, pilgrims began to come quietly to her tomb. Women lit candles, murmured prayers for safe childbirth, sought her intercession as though she were already a saint. They left tokens, ribbons, rosaries, scraps of embroidered cloth, as offerings to the queen who had endured what they too feared. In their eyes, Jane's suffering had sanctified her, elevating her from consort to martyr. She became not only a figure of history, but a symbol of every woman's silent battle against the dangers of bringing life into the world. As the seasons turned, the memory of Jane Seymour became woven into the fabric of the Tudor myth. Chroniclers wrote of her with reverence, contrasting her virtue with the flaws of Henry's other wives. Catherine had been stubborn and ambitious, but Jane was gentle, obedient, and selfless. Her story was reshaped into a narrative of perfection, a model for queens to follow. Yet, beneath the gilded words, the truth remained darker, that she had died not simply as a queen, but as a woman sacrificed to the relentless demands of a crown. For Henry, Jane's death was both a wound and a weapon. He mourned her genuinely, yet he also used her memory to silence those who criticized his past. When confronted about Anne Boleyn's execution, he would point to Jane's son and declare that God had vindicated his choices. When urged to remarry, he spoke of Jane as irreplaceable, even as he began to consider alliances that would serve his kingdom. In life, Jane had been quiet and modest. In death, she became a symbol wielded by the king to justify his reign. And so the legacy of Jane Seymour grew, her image immortalized not only in stone and song, but in the very heart of Tudor England. She was remembered as the queen who gave England its heir, the queen who died in the service of her duty, the queen whom Henry loved most of all. Her story was not of power seized or thrones defended, but of sacrifice, of a woman who bore the weight of a dynasty and paid with her life. In the quiet crypt of St. George's Chapel, far from the noise of courtly intrigue and the clamors of politics, she lay in eternal stillness. Above her the chapel bells tolled for generations yet to come, each peal a reminder of the gentle queen whose life and death had shaped the course of a kingdom. Time, relentless and unyielding, moved forward after Jane Seymour's death. Seasons shifted. The court changed its garments from black mourning to the brighter silks of politics, and yet her absence lingered like a shadow that could not be banished. Hampton Court, once alive with her quiet presence, seemed emptier, as though its walls remembered her gentle steps, her soft voice, her restrained smile. Henry VIII, though outwardly restored to his role as king and ruler, carried with him a hollow wound that no display of majesty could fill. In the months after her passing, the memory of Jane grew into something larger than life. She had been a quiet woman, modest and unassuming, yet death transformed her into an icon. Courtiers who had barely noticed her when she lived now spoke of her with reverence, praising her obedience, her humility, her piety. Chroniclers painted her as the perfect queen, the one who had embodied all the virtues demanded of a consort. They contrasted her image with Catherine of Aragon's stubborn pride and Anne Boleyn's fiery ambition. Jane, in their telling, was gentle, submissive, and saintly, the model against which all future queens would be measured. For Henry, this transformation was both comfort and weapon. He had loved Jane, of that no one doubted, but he also used her memory to justify his choices, his cruelty, his ambitions. When critics whispered of Anne's execution, he pointed to Edward and declared that God had vindicated him through Jane. When foreign ambassadors pressed him on the instability of his household, he spoke of Jane as the one true wife, the woman God himself had chosen to give him an heir. In his grief, Jane became not only a beloved memory, but also a shield against the judgment of history. Still, his grief was real. Those closest to him saw it in his eyes, in the way he spoke of her long after her death. He kept her portraits near him, her likeness captured in delicate brushstrokes, her pale face gazing with that same serene softness that had defined her life. He wore her memory like a cloak, returning again and again to the idea that she had been the only one who truly loved him without ambition, the only one who had given him what he most desired. In the end, it was Jane Seymour's face, not Catherine's or Anne's, that accompanied him into death. For when he died years later, he was laid to rest beside her in St. George's Chapel. The people of England, too, carried her memory with unusual tenderness. To the common folk, she was not the ambitious schemer of courtly scandal, but the gentle mother who had given them their prince. Women whispered her name in prayers, asking her to intercede for safe childbirth, as though she had become a silent saint for those who faced the same dangers that had claimed her life. Men toasted her in alehouses, their rough voices softened as they spoke of her sacrifice. In Jane's story, they saw not only the triumph of a dynasty, but the fragility of every life touched by duty and fate. As Edward grew, her presence lingered in his nursery. Though he would never know her embrace, the women who cared for him spoke of her often, telling him stories of his mother's gentleness, her prayers, her sacrifice. In the flicker of candlelight, they whispered that he was her gift to England, the last breath of a queen who had given all she had. For Edward, the image of his mother would remain an echo, a figure woven into his identity, a reminder that his very existence was paid for with her life. Henry, though he remarried again, never allowed his later queens to overshadow Jane's memory. Anne of Cleves, whom he married reluctantly for political reasons, was dismissed quickly, annulled and forgotten. Catherine Howard, young and reckless, was executed for her betrayals. Catherine Parr, wise and nurturing, outlived him, but even she could not eclipse Jane's hold upon his heart. In every marriage, Jane remained the measure, the one he called his true wife. Her image became untouchable, polished into perfection by both Henry's grief and his pride. As years passed, historians and poets shaped Jane into something almost mythic. They wrote of her not as a woman of flesh and blood, but as a symbol, the ideal queen, the gentle mother, the martyr of childbirth. Yet behind the polished words, the reality of her suffering remained, carried in the memories of those who had stood by her bed. Her cries, her fever, the slow ebb of her life, all of it lay beneath the surface, unspoken yet present. It was this tension between myth and truth that gave her story its haunting power. In many ways, Jane Seymour's legacy was a paradox. She was remembered as the queen who had succeeded, who had triumphed where others failed, who had given England its long-desired heir. Yet that triumph was inseparable from tragedy. Her life was cut short, her motherhood bound inextricably to her death. She was praised for her obedience, yet that very obedience was what placed her in a role that demanded everything from her and gave nothing back. Her story was not of ambition or conquest, but of sacrifice, and it was that sacrifice that immortalized her. When Henry himself died in 1547, his body was placed beside Jane's in St. George's Chapel, just as he had commanded. The two coffins lay side by side beneath the stone floor, a silent testament to the bond that had defined his memory. Visitors to Windsor would pause at their tomb, reflecting on the strange irony that Jane, the queen who lived the shortest time at his side, would be the one to accompany him in eternity. In that tomb, Henry's restless spirit found the companionship of the one woman he had declared his true love, though her life had been consumed by the very destiny he imposed upon her. Centuries later, Jane Seymour's story continues to resonate. Historians debate her character, her role, her significance, yet all agree that her death marked a turning point in Henry's reign. To some, she remains a saintly figure, the gentle mother who sacrificed herself for England. To others, she is a reminder of the brutal demands placed upon women, whose bodies were treated as vessels for dynasties, whose lives were measured by the children they bore. In her silence, in her submission, in her tragic end, Jane embodies the contradictions of queenship, both exalted and diminished, both revered and forgotten. For those who imagine her final days, the picture is both luminous and harrowing. The gilded bedchamber, heavy with tapestries and incense, filled with the whispers of attendants and the cries of a woman in mortal pain. The joy of a newborn prince, his tiny cry echoing against stone walls, while his mother's strength ebbed away. The king's triumph, his jubilation, followed swiftly by grief too heavy for even his mighty stature to bear. And finally, the silence of a tomb where queen and king lie side by side, bound together by love, ambition, and death. In the end, Jane Seymour's story is not simply that of a queen who bore a son. It is the story of a woman caught in the machinery of history, who gave all she had because the world demanded it, and who was remembered not for the life she lived but for the death that defined her. It is a story of triumph shadowed by loss, of love bound by duty, of glory purchased with blood. And though centuries have passed, the echo of her suffering still lingers, a reminder that behind the crown, behind the throne, there is always a human heart beating, breaking, and finally falling silent. Thus the gentle queen endures, not in the noise of triumph, but in the quiet ache of memory. Her story belongs not only to the Tudors, not only to England, but to all who have ever known that life and death walk hand in hand, that joy and sorrow are but two faces of the same coin. Jane Seymour's life was brief, but her legacy eternal, etched into the stone of Windsor, into the annals of history, and into the hearts of those who still whisper her name. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.